Hello students, welcome back to this course on visual semantics for visual communication. Today we will emphasize and discuss on the aspects of information, communication and media. For last 3 lectures we have been discussing on human communication and the basis of human communication, that is cooperation, and based on that we came up with a model for human cooperative communication. So that sets the context for any human communication that we do, be it verbal or be it by some other modes. We always follow a human cooperative communication model. Now, having said that, we now need to understand how this communication takes place, what are the different components and what are the processes involved. And once we get to know about that, we can further discuss on various aspects of design for visual communication and thus try to understand how this communication takes place and what is the meaning involved with it, which is the core domain of visual semantics. So having said that, let us start today with our module on information, communication and media. So let us first try to understand what information is. If you remember our last very first slide, we talked about communication where the two eyes represent, for the first eye represents me and the second eye represents you or otherwise as well, and there is some kind of information percolation which happens, which leads to a communication which could be direct or one could refer to something else and that is being communicated to you. In this case, for that matter, we are talking about visual semantics. So now coming to the crux of information, we have discussed this earlier as well, but just reminding you, information essentially has two components associated. One is the production of information and the other is the reception of information. And we also discussed that information could be percolated through various modes, which could be spoken, it could be written, it could be signed or it could be gestured. So that sets how the information works in our lives, and there are two distinct aspects regarding that. One is the production and another is reception, and based on that only we discussed about the human cooperative model of communication in the last class, where we looked at the communicator, we looked at the receiver and we looked at the intermediate communication channels or modes which take place. Today we are going to pinpoint on information, what information is and how it works. So if we move on to the next slide, we see that information is something which essentially answers a question. So any information, when we talk about, is trying to give an answer to a particular question. The question could be asked or a question could be hidden or it could be a query for which you seek for an information and it tends to answer that. For example, if you are looking for a particular person, you look by that person's name. Now name is a particular information and that particular name refers to a particular entity, and that's what you are trying to look for. So basically this particular information, the name, is actually an answer to a query, to a need that you are looking for. So in short, information is always related to a question that you are asking for, and then it percolates into two different aspects of information. As we talk about this, there are two different aspects of information which surface out. One aspect of information is data and the other aspect of information is knowledge. So talking about data, data is something which is related to some kind of a value or some kind of parameter or some kind of assignment of a value to a parameter. So data ranges between these factors. It is generally a value or a parameter or some kind of value that you assign to a parameter. So data always comes in this form. And another very interesting fact about data is mostly ubiquitous. Data is available everywhere, and data is prevalent in around us or in nature, but that has to be processed in a particular manner until it becomes an information. For to explain this otherwise, say for example number is a particular form of data. By numbers we represent various entities or parameterize various entities or assign a value to certain things by inclusion of numbers, but this number alone doesn't create an information, or in other words, the number alone doesn't answer to your question until and unless it is structured in a particular manner. So that means that data is around, data is ubiquitous, but not necessarily that forms an information which serves a particular purpose or tries to answer a particular need or question that you are posing. So for this data to transfer into information, there is another aspect associated, which is the knowledge aspect. So we talked about the data aspect, which is more or less independent. So data is more or less independent, which while forming information needs another aspect related to it, which is the knowledge aspect. And the knowledge aspect, as we all know, is very much personalized and is dependent on certain factors. So knowledge is a personalized form of data or information, and it is very much dependent on certain factors. And these factors are, if we go back to the slide, these factors are the cognitive factors, the observer's association based on that, and the discreteness of the observer. So basically these three are very, very essential criteria for knowledge and the dependency of knowledge thus. So one part is the cognition. Cognition, as we discussed on the last lecture, cognition and recognition relates to the learning process of a particular individual. So the knowledge is also dependent on the learning capacity, the learning capability to exposure, the exposure to various information and data, exposure to various experiences, exposure to different situations and aspects. All of these together create a cognitive pattern, and this cognition, when works in a collective manner, in a collaborative manner, we referred to as socio cognition in the last lecture. So many a times it could be a collective cognition which helps in gathering the knowledge or forming the knowledge base. That happens based on a social structure or a social paradigm or a social observation scheme where you imbibe lot of information and form your knowledge base. So that means that cognition at an individual level, at a social level, at a group level, at a community level is very, very important when it comes to knowledge aspect of information. The next aspect we talked about in information is the observer based aspect. In other words, it is based on the individual. If you remember the triangle, the bicycle story we talked about last day, there was context, there was experience, and there was assumption. So the experiential aspect, the very individualistic perception and situations which arise to an individual revolves around this particular factor. This factor is at the discretion of an individual, and based on that the knowledge is associated with that particular individual. So that knowledge has a dependency on that factor as well. And if we look at the last but not the least, of course, of the aspect related to knowledge, it is very, very discrete in comparison with the ubiquitous character of data. Data is available everywhere, as I said, or data is more independent and generic in nature, whereas knowledge is very, very discrete, very personalized, very, very modified and sequential for a particular individual. So, this two difference we need to learn or understand very precisely when we talk about information, because information many a times is used in a very generic pattern, in a very generic manner. For different disciplines information is used, but we have to understand information has two parts. One is the data part, which is independent, and one is the knowledge part, which is very much dependent, and these two talk to each other, combine with each other, form different formations for creation of this information or usage of this information in a particular manner. So, that gives us an understanding of what information is. So, let us move on further now. If we move on further with this slide now, we come to a point where we understand that information is either propagated or conveyed. So, we have been talking about this in the last class as well, where we have a communicator and a receiver, and an information is propagated, or so information is propagated or communicated. So, it is always in a communication it is percolated through a communication mode, but the question comes is how this happens. What are the modalities of information being propagated or conveyed. So, if we see, there are two distinct channels or methods by which this happens. One is by formation of messages. So, messages are very common to human life, human practice. In our day-to-day lives, we communicate by formation of various messages. You must be all using mobile phones, and you are using a very legitimate number of words to convey a lot of information from one person to another in form of an SMS or in form of a textual message, a small message which is being propagated over a particular media from one person to another. So, this is an example how the messages are formed. Messages are small packets of information which are very, very direct and which are being communicated. So, information packaged in form of message is communicated. The other form of communication is by observation. So, many a times when we are observing a certain aspect or a certain phenomena, either directly or indirectly, we are actually gathering the information, or we are actually conveying or propagating the information. Say, for example, when you are sitting alone in your chair and you are observing a sunrise, Now, this is a form of information. This is a info that it is morning or it is sunny. So, whatever you are observing here directly is actually creating some form of information, and that information is being propagated and propagated within yourself. So, many a times the information is within yourself. We have talked about intrapersonal communication last day. So, this is a form of intrapersonal communication which is happening because of the information percolation, conveyance based on a direct observation. Similarly, there could be indirect observation which keeps on happening in our day-to-day lives. We keep on observing various situations, we keep observing different other people in a society. We grow up observing or mimicking or imitating other people, and hence we live in a society or a particular culture. So, all of this together is a form of information conveyance, or is a modality of information where we are trying to propagate or convey this information. So, two distinct branches are of information conveyance is there. One is in form of a message which is a very direct and tailor-made form of information conveyance, where it is very direct. There is no scope of ambiguity. There is it is many a times based on linguistics and conventions. On the other hand, there is another way of conveyance which is based on observation, where we are observing a situation, and the observation could be either direct or indirect. So if you see, many of the scientific developments actually emerged in form of many of the scientific information what we have got has evolved through the observation based approach. You know, if you look at Newton's story, an apple falling down from the tree, Newton observed that, and that was the root of formation of laws of gravitation, or an entire genre of physics revolving around that. That information actually has been having its roots in this observational aspect of information communication. So both are equally important, both are equally used in our day-to-day lives in human communication. So information and communication goes hand in hand when it comes to messaging and when it comes to observation. So now if we look at both message and observation, a very key aspect comes into picture, that both of them involve human perception. This is very, very essential for our particular course, where we are talking about visual communication and visual semantics. Visual, the very word visual relates to our eyes. We are looking something, we are looking at something, we are seeing something, we are visually perceiving that. So to understand, or even to start with visual communication or visual perception, we really need to talk a little bit about the perception as well. And in this very particular slide, you can see that both messaging and observation, which is a form of information propagation or conveyance, is ultimately dependent on human perception. In our next lecture, we will actually dwell more on human perception, and we will talk in detail about that. Moving on with the next slide, we see that information reduces uncertainty. So we looked at one quality of information, which was information tries to answer or tries to respond to a particular query or a particular need of ours. When we are looking for something or we need something, we are searching for an answer, we seek for an information. What we try to gather is an information. And another very quality of information is it reduces uncertainty, ambiguousness. It reduces, it is trying to help us in pinpointing a particular solution. So information is direct or tries to reduce the uncertainty. If it is indirect, information is misleading, that creates a breach in communication. So there would be a breach in communication. Many a times it is referred to as noise. So if information is direct, it is trying to reduce the uncertainty, it is trying to pinpoint directly, talk about or respond to the query that you are talking about. So the quality of information is predominantly that, but in case it is not, it could be misleading, it could lead to a breach in communication, and it will create a noise which is unwanted, which is not required. So to give you an example, when you walk around in a particular street, which is say a market street in your city or town or village, when you walk around, you see lot of banners or advertisement which are being hanged on the walls or which are being put up on the billboard, and it has got tremendous amount of information being written there, either textual or graphical. So there are a lot of messages, lot of information being put up in those advertisements, and what you many a times face is it is ambiguous, it leads to uncertainty, rather than reducing uncertainty. So say for example you are looking for a particular advertisement, or you are looking for a particular signage of a shop, you are trying to search a particular shop, but because of this chaos now, because of this multiplicity of information, because of this multiplicity of visual chaos, you are unable to find out directly the information that you are looking for. So this is an example where it is the information structuring or the information, overall information, which is creating uncertainty rather than reducing uncertainty. And again, going back to the communication slide, if we look now, communication is relating to the Latin word which means sharing, and this sharing actually has to reduce this uncertainty. We are communicating with each other. There are different types of communication we have talked about. It is within the individual, with one individual to another, it could be within a group, it could be amongst group. So there could be different types of communication, and in all of this communication we are trying to share some kind of information which is meaningful. We are trying to share some kind of information which answers, which responds to a particular need of either the group or the other individual or self or the community or the organization. So we are trying to respond to that in a holistic manner, in a shared approach. We are trying to do that, and in order to do that, we are trying to reduce the uncertainty. We are trying to envisage on the two qualities of information we just now talked about. The one quality is it is trying to reduce the uncertainty, it is trying to pinpoint to a particular solution or an answer, and second, it is actually answering to a particular query or a need or seeking a response. So this particular diagram gives us a better understanding of how the communication is happening in a graphical format. So we may have different individuals, or it could be a group, or it could be even set of groups or community or culture, and there could be another entity of similar sort or of dissimilar sort, and within them there is an act of propagation or communicating, based on which we started our discussion on information and communication today, that there is an aspect of propagating and conveying, and this act of propagation is called the communication. So basically, information we talked about is relating to data and knowledge. Data is very independent and ubiquitous, whereas knowledge is very, very dependent and discrete. Now, having talked about that, this forms the basis of information in a whole, and this information is being percolated from one to another, or it is conveyed or propagated from one to another, and this very act of conveying is called the communication. And hence, when we are talking about visual communication or any other mode of communication, we are precisely talking of this act of communication and different modes of this communication which happens. Now, coming to several steps of communication, we have in our last lecture we talked about the model for human cooperative communication. So you will find the similarities with that particular model, and this step of communication very precisely relate to the communicational need, the communicational intention we talked about last day. If you remember, the communicator and the receiver, it starts with a goal, then you have social intention, then you have communicational intention, and communicational intention is percolated by certain amount of signals, and that signal is comprehended or analyzed. Reasoning is applied at the receiver's end. So that we have discussed in our last class. But what we relate today is various steps of communication. Steps of communication are actually a substrata of communicational intention. So if we look at what are the different steps of communication, so first is the formation of the communication intent, which is exactly in line with the model for communication we talked about yesterday. So the formation of the intent is very, very important, and then it is the composition of the message or information itself. So the message or information need to be composed. In other words, in order to do this, one needs to understand which are the relevant data one needs to look at, and at the same time utilize the knowledge of the self and have an understanding about the knowledge of the recipient of this particular message or information, and based on that you structure your message. And as a next step, what you do is you use encoding and decoding of information. We talked about this yesterday as well, that a message is predominantly a code, or a language is predominantly a code and is dependent on various encoding and decoding of that particular code. So one needs to look at various data, various knowledge base, and then try to encode this particular aspect of information into a message or into a meaningful information, and then this encoded message is transmitted, and it is transmitted as a sequence of signals using a medium. So any message, after it is being formed, structured, has to be conveyed, has to be propagated. We talked about that in our if you remember the diagram, it has to be propagated, and this is propagated in terms of some kind of signal, some kind of symbolic aspect which relates to the entire discipline of semiotics and semantics. We'll come to that a little later in this particular course, but the idea is it goes out in form of some packets, and these packets are the signals which we talked about in our last lecture also in the model for communication, and these signals percolate and reaches the receiver. So as soon as it reaches the receiver, there is reception of these signals. So these signals are being received by the receiver, and then the intended message is reconstructed. So the message which is flowing from me goes out as a media and then reaches you, and then you are trying to decode it, you are trying to comprehend it, you are trying to analyze it and make meaning out of it. And then comes the last step where you are interpreting and making sense of the reconstructed message. So this mode of communication is happening all the time. From nothing you create a message, then you lead into a propagation using some kind of medium that reaches someone. That person tries to put back the pieces into his own cognitive sense, into his own discrete knowledge base, and tries to reconstruct the meaning which I intended to communicate. It reaches to you, you reconstruct it, perceive it, understand it, and make meaning out of it. So these are various steps of communication, very logical, very legitimate steps of communication. But many a times, coming to design, we often forget about these steps, which are very, very essential for any mode of communication, be it visual or be it other modes. We many a times try to bypass the social intentions. We many a times forget the communicational intent. Many a times we are misled by the referential intent. We tend to form wrong references without taking into consideration whom the reference means to. So in any form of communication, these steps always has to be kept in mind, and hence the communication needs to be designed. So that brings us to the end of this lecture on information and communication. We will start with information communication and the media bit, how the media acts as a very, very important aspect to information communication. We will start with that in our next lecture. Thank you for your patient listening.